Good morning, Dr. Wright and Dr. Wright's Digital Humanities class. My name is Lisa Patterson, and this is my week 3 reflection video. So I have some notes over here that I took from watching this last Wednesday's lecture. So without further ado, we read 4 different pieces about hack and yak, about a little bit about neoliberalism, and essentially all the pieces were dancing around the topic of what the digital humanities encompasses in terms of what exactly is the most important components of the work involved in the digital humanities. But the first thing that Dr. Wright mentioned in class is that he asked of a cool digital humanities project that we might have run into. Interesting for me is something that calls attention to my emotions. And in the third reading, the one that was talking about if the digital communities can be critiqued, there was a project mentioned that was it's from a organization called From the Center, and it involved a Vimeo video of a woman who had a daughter named Miracle. And this woman grew up in a difficult situation where her mom was in jail for using drugs, and this woman had to take care of her little siblings from a young age. She had a rough life, especially from the beginning. And all of a sudden, she found herself as a young mother at the age of 23, 24, and her third baby was tested HIV negative, even though the mother was HIV positive from being with a man who was HIV positive and didn't tell her. So after this woman gave birth to her baby that was HIV negative, it really impacted her life, and she started a career in education, specifically sex education, when it comes to things like HIV and sexually transmitted illnesses. Now, this project was really interesting to me because it was something that is real and important to a lot of people, and important in the fact where it's the topic of trauma for a lot of people. So I thought that this was a digital humanities project that really touched upon the humanity side of what the digital humanities entices. So Lainey also mentioned that her favorite, or one of the cool projects that she found, was something called the Online Hate Index. I didn't see that, so I thought it was really cool that it showed the evolution of hate speech across social platforms, specifically alt-right hate speech. So I thought it was interesting to think about the evolution of that and how that can be actually analyzed to try to figure out how these people are thinking and why they're thinking like this. Now, Madeline later in class asked a question after Dr. Wright mentioned more about the outline of what should we be doing in our writings, which involved having a clear argument, a clear title that describes our argument, and following our argument with evidence, and having the entire paper polished. So, like I said, after Dr. Wright mentioned that, Madeline asked a question, and she was asking, in the first piece that we read, were they saying that hack is good and that yak is bad, or what is the whole point of saying more hack, less yak? I know that Dr. Wright said that it started as kind of a myth that hacking and yakking are conflicting things within the digital humanities, and that there's not actually a real argument going on between both of them. So I thought that it was interesting because I know that the phrase was actually coined as more of a joke. It was originally Less Talk, More Grok, as a spin-off of 80s rock and roll. And I thought that it was like a spin-off of talking about how the conventional digital humanities conferences were really long-winded and not everyone was included, and especially like the people who these projects are about are especially not included in the discussions about how to continue forward in the studying of digital humanities. So I thought it was interesting how Dr. Wright mentioned that it was actually like a myth that hacking and yakking are separate, and how it was like the perception of conflict and the memory of how the phrase was coined that took its own whirlwind, if you should say. I thought it was interesting that camps usually preceded like the regular digital humanities conferences, because it seemed like there was the counterpart to the more formal event that introduced ideas where people are speaking obviously like less formally, but because of that more inclusively. It makes me ask the question like how much of the digital humanities is about the digital part and how much of it is about the humanities part. In my opinion, also I think in the essay that I'm going to be writing this week is going to be centered around that question, because obviously like the digital part is the tools and the basis of how to perform the digital humanities, but the content, which is humanities, which includes like race, gender, class, all of those is really like the core of what the digital humanities is trying to study. So I thought that it was interesting that it seems like it's so separate now. And later in class, Sid asked about Natalia's piece. I think her last name is like Cesare. He was confused about the metaphor to the Harlem Renaissance, and it was kind of like an obscure metaphor, but I also took it as the digital humanities going through a sort of identity crisis and them having this internal conflict of not really knowing how to define themselves, but at the same time like wanting to do so in such a way that is progressive in hopes for like establishing the industry, the digital humanities industry, as something that is important enough to actually continue to get funding too. So Dr. Wright, you asked a question of the article of when digital humanities was in vogue, or that camp theory. You asked what the point of that article was, and I thought that the author was making the argument that digital humanities is not only about the tools, but also about the content that those tools are being used for. It's not just the practice or the theory, it's a combination of the both, and you can't really have one without the other. So I think that that's great evidence for my essay that I hope to be writing about, which is like what part of digital humanities is, or does the digital humanities entail more digital or more humanities? And I think those questions usually have the answers that is both. Like they have both of them in such a combination that you can't have one without the other. So Elijah later on in class asked the question, why can't we combine like the neoliberal values with race, class, and gender, or the values of digital or the humanities? Like why can't neoliberalism and humanities really go together? I thought that the answer to that was because a lot of the time like the actual structure behind the digital humanities industry leaves out a lot of the people that the entire industry is supposed to be serving. In one of the articles, it was actually from that same From the Center Miracle Vimeo video that I saw. There was a quote that I thought that was really cool. She said that, here I have it written down, I'm gonna try to find it. She said that so the quote is, their presence suggests that the privileged sphere of digital scholarship need not remain hermetically sealed from those who go through things like this in this life. So I thought that it was interesting to point out the fact that what the digital humanities really needs is those people that are talked about in these projects and including them in the study of the humanities. Because really, like, I think that the whole point of it is trying to understand more about equality, but first inequality, and then talking about the people that are underrepresented, underserved. Really, the biggest thing that we should do is include them in our discussions and in the work. So I think that neoliberalism so far kind of contrasts that, because it only serves the people who are already making money, already in power. And in reality, the whole structure, in order for there to be true equality, which is what we are trying to strive for, the whole structure needs to be turned upside down. And the people that are already in power need to give other people a chance to be able to have their voice heard. So, Dr. Wright also mentioned something about the fourth article that we read, the one about neoliberalism. So you said that this was a piece that people use in order to dismiss digital humanities to be a neoliberal tool. That's interesting that you said that. I didn't know that the article was cited as so, because I thought that it was evidence for how the digital humanities and academia actually thrives under the neoliberal structure that is more like pro-profit instead of like pro-people. And I understand that that's a theme common under a lot of the university environment as a whole. However, I thought that it's even more ironic that the digital humanities also is under the umbrella of that theme, because thinking about how the digital humanities claims to work for the humanities, it seems like it's such a more explicit example of how unfair the structure really is, because all the while digital humanities programs are being funded, the programs that talk about race and gender studies and class studies, they're getting nixed and even less funded. And so if the digital humanities are trying to stay unpoliticized in order to be able to claim that they're on one side of a line, I don't know, something like that rubs me the wrong way. So I think it's important that those projects of the digital humanities that seem to be exemptions of that, because there are definitely projects that talk about the people that need to be served and include the people that are in need to be served. But I think one of the articles also mentioned that those projects are usually taken as exemptions, and then they exemplify those exemptions in order to cover up the fact that most of the practice of digital humanities, or most of the industry I should say, does not undergo or does not strive to really think about the humanities part of the digital humanities, more about the tools that can be sold for profit, the jobs that could be used in order to ask for funding from universities. So I think that this week was very interesting in the readings, especially because it highlighted a lot of the discrepancies within digital humanities that apparently produce a lot of debate within the industry itself and within the people that work especially in academia. So I think that this week's class was exceptionally interesting. I also really liked the end of class where Dr. Wright, you had us revise some sentences. It was funny because I rewrote my sentence, the first sentence that had something to do with aligning with the past. Scholars must consider all the viewpoints, reflect upon contemporary values, and in order to tell an honest history. So I rewrote that sentence, and then once you started reading other people's, I realized how mine was also still too wordy. So it's definitely good practice. I appreciate that activity. I think this video has gone on a little long. I thought that it was going to be harder to talk for so long, but I appreciate this. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you next week.